Do you believe in knights, in those shining armored warriors who swore to protect the weak, uphold justice, and follow an unbreakable code of honor? In those who, by Hollywood standards, prevented cruelty, fought nobly, and were always on the side of good? This image, carefully crafted by 18th century romantics and reinforced by modern cinema, is nothing more than a beautiful fairy tale, a convenient one, but completely out of sync with medieval reality. Because the true code of honor, which supposedly prevented atrocities and ensured noble warfare, was an illusion, not a law. Forget that gleaming ideal. Instead, imagine yourself a merchant, your caravan slowly making its way down a dusty road. You're counting on protection, or at the very least, adherence to established tariffs. Suddenly, riders emerge from the trees, not the kind you read about in ballads. These are the local lords' armed enforcers, their faces crude, their smiles predatory. They stop you demanding a toll, 3 times the usual amount. You try to object, citing old laws, appealing to rights. But their steely gazes make it clear, here they are the law. And just like that, you're no longer on the road, but dragged into the nearest grove. The cold steel presses against your throat. Your goods, which you spent months acquiring, vanish into the sacks of these protectors. Cry for help. All you get in return is laughter. Your money, your dignity, your safety, all of it evaporates in an instant to the indifferent soundtrack of the forest. And this isn't lawlessness, this is their law, their right, their order. What you just experienced was the norm, not an exception. It's a sensory shock that instantly shatters the myth of noble chivalry. The reason this happened lies in a profound divergence between our modern notions of morality and the pragmatic, sometimes brutal logic of the medieval world. Many of the facts we think we know about the Middle Ages, including the idealized image of knights, were either fabricated or heavily romanticized in the 18th century. The humanist writers of that era needed a stark contrast, a terrible past, to highlight the progress of their own enlightened age. Thus, the image of the knight as a protector emerged, while their actual deeds, often far from noble, were either forgotten or rewritten. The real actions of knights, as we'll see, often contradicted what we consider honorable today. They were people of their time, bound by its brutal rules of survival and power. Today, we will dissect this noble illusion. You will discover how medieval codes of honor truly worked, why the myths about outlaw knights are far from the truth, and what shocking truth lies behind the laws of war and noble battles. Prepare for a journey into a world where ideals shatter against steel and cold calculation. We tend to view nobility as a universal principle. However, in the Middle Ages, it was more of a tool, a means to justify power and economic dominance. What we perceive as nobility was often just a thin veil for pragmatic brutality and cold economic calculation, where personal gain and the maintenance of power were valued far above abstract concepts of honor. A knight might be noble in his dealings with his liege lord or an equal in status, but utterly ruthless towards a commoner, and this wasn't considered a contradiction in his time. But if even in times of peace, nobility was merely a facade, then what happened when it came to real war and the fall of impregnable castles? Here, the code of honor clashed with far more brutal laws of war, and the consequences were truly horrifying. The popular image of a knight often portrays them as a noble warrior who, even in the most difficult times, would never stoop to systematic plunder. The code of honor, according to this myth, forbade attacking the defenseless and, by extension, merchants or travelers. But was this truly the case? We've come to think of the robber knight as an integral part of the medieval landscape. Sinister shadows lurking on forest roads, castles harboring bloodthirsty lords ready to plunder anyone who had the misfortune of venturing onto their lands. This image is deeply ingrained in our minds. Picture yourself as a minor feudal lord. Your lands are depleted, your income is dwindling, but the expenses for maintaining your status, for armor, and for your retinue are only growing. Your castle is decaying, and your servants are starving. You stand on the castle wall, surveying your meager holdings. Suddenly, in the distance, on the only road that cuts through your lands, a rich caravan appears. The camels are heavily laden with silks, spices, and silver. Gold glitters in the sun's rays. Your heart begins to pound wildly, and a wild, desperate plan forms in your mind. This is it, salvation. You feel that itch in your palms, that rush of adrenaline, that whisper of despair pushing you to the brink, but before you give the order, a lump catches in your throat. You remember your liege lord, your oath, the unwritten rules. One reckless act of plunder, and you'll forfeit not only your backing, but also the meager scraps of income you still have. Your small holding will become a cursed place, shunned by all, and then you'll be left utterly alone, defenseless against the enemies you are sure to make. Such a temptation, it would seem, should have spawned legions of robber knights. But historical reality, as it always does, defies our expectations. In fact, the concept of the Raubritter, as we commonly understand it, a malicious knight living solely by plunder, only emerged in the 18th century. It was born on the pages of romantic chivalric novels, where the main character needed a formidable yet unequivocally evil antagonist. This was a convenient literary device, created for contrast rather than for historical accuracy. In the Middle Ages, true robber knights were extremely rare. Most known cases date back to the late 15th to early 16th century, when the feudal system was already crumbling, and the minor aristocracy was losing its significance and income. Their actions were not the norm, but a sign of a deep systemic crisis. The feudal economy, contrary to popular belief, actively discouraged systematic plunder. Lords were well aware, by devastating trade routes, they would forfeit not only transit tolls, but also income from fares, inns, and other services. Protecting merchants was in their direct economic interest. Actions that might be termed banditry were often just the excessive collection of legitimate tolls or part of feudal disputes, so-called feuds, which, though violent, had their own legal basis and were not random acts of plunder. For instance, the city of Frankfurt, between 1371 and 1440, was involved in 226 more or less legitimate feudal conflicts. These were small-scale wars, not acts of indiscriminate banditry. A more common form of banditry among the impoverished nobility was kidnapping for ransom. By capturing a wealthy merchant, a knight could secure a substantial sum without completely destroying the trade route. This was a calculated, albeit criminal, enterprise, not blind plunder. A notable example is the abduction of the Nuremberg merchant Balthasar Baumgartner by Hans von Absberg in 1522. The merchant was held for 6 weeks until a ransom was paid. True robber knights were not romantic villains, but rather economic criminals whose actions undermined the very feudal system instead of being its norm. Their emergence was a symptom of decline, not of the flourishing of chivalry. Feudal society, for all its brutality, was structured and sought order, because only through order could taxes be collected and power maintained. The destabilization of trade routes was tantamount to suicide for any feudal lord. So, highway robbery by knights was a rare exception, contradicting the very logic of the feudal economy. But if this type of violence was unprofitable and therefore uncommon, what happened then when entire castles fell under the assault of noble armies? Here, the code of honor clashed with far more brutal laws of war, and the consequences were incomparably more horrific. We still believe that even during castle sieges, knights adhered to certain rules of war, minimizing the suffering of civilians and prisoners guided by principles of honor. This image, where after a heroic assault, the victors offer honorable surrender and the defeated leave in peace, is a deeply ingrained myth, but the reality was far harsher. Cinema often shows us dramatic yet clean conquests. Castles surrender, commanders negotiate, and knights respect the laws of war. But what if these very laws didn't protect, but rather encourage the most horrific atrocities? Imagine the gates collapsing. You hear the crash of stone, the splintering of wood, and then the acrid stench of burning mixed with the smell of blood. The screams don't cease for 3 days, becoming the constant backdrop to your agony. All around you is chaos, the pounding of boots, the clash of weapons, unfamiliar voices filled with triumph and rage. You feel a stranger's hand snatch your child, another sees your wife. Your family is torn apart right before your eyes, sorted into valuable and worthless. Children are ripped from their mothers, siblings torn from each other to be sold in different markets hundreds of miles from home. You watch this unfold and you understand this isn't war, this is the end of everything you've ever known. The horror you just imagined wasn't a random outburst of cruelty, but a systematic, legally sanctioned procedure. Medieval law included a principle known as jus praedae, the right of spoil. This meant that if a castle fell by storm, rather than surrendering by agreement, then everything inside became the lawful property of the attackers. Buildings, supplies, livestock, and yes, people. This was not considered a war crime, nor was it excessive force, but rather a standard operating procedure understood by every garrison commander. When a castle fell by storm, it often led to a 72-hour sack. This was a period of systematic and legally sanctioned looting, murder, and violence. No distinction was made between soldiers and civilians during this time. Women, the elderly, and children were all considered fair game. Chroniclers described this with euphemisms like the usual excesses, what typically happens, or the rights of soldiers. Everyone knew that the law allowed it. Churches, contrary to romanticized notions, offered no protection. Sanctuary was church law, but church law only applied when someone was willing to enforce it. And at that moment, those with weapons decided that church rules didn't apply today. Priests died trying to protect civilians, but the civilians died nonetheless. Economic considerations dictated the fate of the survivors. Nobles and wealthy merchants were taken hostage for ransom. Dead aristocrats don't pay. Young, healthy men were sold into slavery for labor. Women and children were destined for domestic service. Skilled artisans with valuable trades also found themselves in slave wagons. Everyone else, those too old, too young, too sick, or simply too numerous to transport, held no economic value. They were either left to starve on the roads or killed on the spot, as it was simpler than managing them. This was not an act of rage, but a cold, pragmatic business. Medieval laws of war didn't protect. Rather, they legalized terror. They transformed it into a deliberate military strategy where atrocities were not the exception, but the norm. This system was perfectly engineered for its goal, to make resistance so prohibitively expensive that future garrisons would surrender at the earliest opportunity. But before the castle falls, a battle ensues. And here, the myths of noble combat shatter against the harsh reality, where survival was prized above all honor. Romanticized notions claim that the chivalric code of honor dictated the rules of engagement, favoring elegant sword duels and avoiding ignoble methods like wrestling or the use of peasant weapons. We see this in films: graceful swordplay, dramatic duels where victory is achieved not through brute force, but through elegant mastery. However, this depiction is a far cry from the reality of the true, brutal, and pragmatic medieval battlefield. Imagine a battlefield where there's no room for ballet. You are a knight clad in 40-pound armor. Feel the weight of your lance, a 12-foot shaft of solid wood with a sharp steel tip. It burns your hands in mere seconds if you hold it horizontally. You hear the thunder of hooves as hundreds like you, with lances lowered, charge towards the enemy. Impact! Your lance pierces shields, chainmail, bodies. You feel it shatter into splinters. The inertia almost throws you from your horse. Now, you've been dismounted, and in your hands, it's not a sword, but a heavy battle axe. Every blow demands your entire body. Every swing sends tremors through your arms. The metallic clang as your axe finds its target. A helmet, a plate of armor. You're not trying to cleave through. You're trying to stun to disorient. At some point, your weapon loses its purpose. You engage in a desperate struggle in the mud, trying to wrestle your opponent down to find a gap in his armor. You hear your own heavy breathing echoing inside your helmet, feel your strength draining away, your muscles burning with agonizing fatigue, and the fight is far from over. And then comes the moment when your opponent is finally downed. You loom over him, drawing your dagger. This is no noble strike. It's a search for a gap in the armor's joints, under the armpit, or through the visor slit. You press down with all your weight, feeling the steel tear through metal, and then into flesh. And instead of dramatic music, there are only gasps and a grinding sound. This sensory experience isn't just shocking. It reveals the brutal truth about medieval combat. Knights fought not for show, but for survival. The swords Hollywood loved so much were expensive and required years of training, but were rarely the primary weapon. They were often used as a backup when the primary weapon, the spear, broke after the first strike. Real combat was exhausting. Knights in armor weighing 40 to 60 pounds, quickly tired, and actual engagements lasted mere seconds, not minutes. After just 10 to 15 seconds of intense combat, their strength was depleted, and fighters retreated to catch their breath. The primary workhorses on the battlefield were spears and polearms, halberds, glaives, and poleaxes. These versatile and deadly tools were effective against armor and indispensable in formation. The halberd, for example, combined a spike for thrusting attacks, an axe blade for chopping, and a hook for pulling riders off their horses. Against armor, impact and crushing weapons were used, such as maces and warhammers. They were specifically designed to pierce or deform armor, causing concussions, fractures, and internal injuries, even if the armor was not fully penetrated. A warhammer could crack a helmet, while a mace could shatter bones beneath the steel. In close combat, knights frequently employed grappling. When weapon strikes proved ineffective against armor, fighters would close in, attempting to unbalance their opponent, take them down, and find vulnerable spots for a dagger. Daggers, especially rondelles, were specifically designed for finishing off fallen armored opponents. Their narrow, rigid blades could penetrate armor gaps into armpits, joints, and visor slits. This act, paradoxically known as mercy, was an extremely brutal yet effective way to quickly end the fight. True, knightly combat was no ballet, but an exhausting struggle for survival. Here, victory went to whoever could inflict more damage faster using any available means. Mercy was merely a way to quickly end the agony, not an act of humanism. Efficiency and pragmatism dictated the choice of weapons and tactics, leaving little room for nobility as we understand it today. And if such pragmatic brutality prevailed on the battlefield, how then did the code of chivalry influence the daily lives of knights and their treatment of those beneath them when there was no immediate threat? This brings us to a deeply ingrained myth, that the chivalric code of honor was an all-encompassing moral compass that bound knights to uphold justice, defend the weak, and exhibit noble conduct towards all members of society. This idea is inspiring, but it doesn't hold up against historical reality. Imagine a world where your life and honor mean nothing, where nobility is a word reserved only for the privileged, but to you, it's an empty phrase. These aren't just words. This is the reality millions lived in, confronting chivalric honor daily. Imagine the utter helplessness of a peasant. His daughter, his only hope, has been raped by a noble knight passing through. You try to find justice, but where do you turn? To the local lord, who simply laughs in your face? To the church, which turns its back? Your justice is nothing but a cruel mockery, a cold wind chilling you to the bone. You hear the law itself justify violence against those without status, against those who cannot afford protection, or, even worse, you witness an influential lord, your own suzerain, simply buying his way out of punishment for crimes committed by his knights. He'll pay a fine, perhaps even with your own tax money, and it will all be forgotten. And your pain, your tragedy, they're nothing more than a statistical blip in his reign. This stark reality reveals how far the idealized image of a knight was from their everyday conduct. The chivalric code primarily applied to relationships between knights themselves. Violations against other knights could be severely punished through raids on their homes and the killing of servants, as described in medieval chronicles. But when it came to commoners, here the rules were completely different. Knights frequently committed grave offenses such as murder, rape, and robbery, especially against commoners, and more often than not, they avoided harsh penalties. Given the weak central authority, the aristocracy could function as a sort of mafia, where the threat of violence was an integral part of the system for resource extraction. Of course, laws did exist, even to protect serfs, but their enforcement hinged on numerous factors: the context, the victim's status, and most importantly, the presence of influential allies willing to ensure justice. Without such an ally, the odds of justice were virtually non-existent. Historical examples clearly illustrate this duality. Consider Sir Thomas Malory, a renowned 15th century knight and author of Le Morte d'Arthur. He was accused of numerous violent crimes, including rape and robbery. His actions, which today would be considered monstrous, often went unpunished, and his imprisonments were attributed more to political reasons than to actual criminal offenses. This was not an isolated incident, but a reflection of a systemic problem where status granted impunity. The chivalry of knights was more a tool for maintaining hierarchy and power among the elite than a universal moral principle that extended to everyone. Justice was a luxury not accessible to all, and more often than not, it came with a price a commoner simply couldn't afford. Consequently, the code of honor served to regulate the nobility internally, but offered no protection to those lower on the social ladder. So, we see the myth of the noble knight crumbling to pieces, revealing an uncomfortable truth. But why is this myth so persistent, and what does it hide from us? We've already seen how selectively this code of honor operated in daily life, protecting only its own and leaving everyone else vulnerable. But now, with all myths shattered, it's time to look at the full picture to understand the uncomfortable truth that centuries of romanticization have so painstakingly hidden. Throughout our journey, we encountered the same illusion, that the chivalric code of honor was an impenetrable barrier, preventing brutal crimes and atrocities and ensuring honorable warfare. This image, inspiring and captivating, became deeply ingrained in the minds of many generations. In reality, the romanticized image of the knight as a protector and upholder of universal morality is a profound distortion of history. It obscures the true, far more uncomfortable nature of medieval power and violence. The myth of the Raubritter, or noble knights who engaged in highway robbery, was created in the 18th century as a convenient literary trope. Actual robber knights were an extremely rare and late phenomenon, emerging towards the very end of the Middle Ages when the feudal economy itself could no longer sustain itself. Systematic plunder was unprofitable and actively suppressed, as it undermined the very foundation of feudal lords' income. But what unfolded when castles fell wasn't just brutality, but legally sanctioned atrocities. The principle of jus praedae, the right to plunder, legalized mass killings, rape, and enslavement for 72 hours following a successful assault. Women, children, the elderly, all became legitimate prey. This was no accident, not an uncontrolled rampage, but a calculated military strategy designed to demoralize and compel surrender. The battlefield was no place for elegant duels. Knightly combat was an exhausting, brutal struggle for survival. Swords were merely secondary weapons. The primary tools were spears, polearms, and crushing weapons like halberds, warhammers, and maces, all designed to pierce or deform heavy armor. And when weapons became useless, the fight devolved into wrestling, grappling, and the use of rondel daggers, specifically designed to finish off defeated opponents by targeting the gaps in their armor. This was mercy, a swift way to end their agony, far from any notion of nobility. The code of honor itself was selective. It applied primarily to relationships between equals, specifically between other knights. Crimes against commoners, such as murder, rape, and robbery, often went unpunished or had minimal consequences. The legality or illegality of an action depended on the victim's status and their ability to find influential patrons. What today seems like a monstrous crime to us was, under medieval laws of war, absolutely legal and considered part of a calculated military strategy. Now that you know the truth, try to shake off these images. Feel how your comfortable illusion crumbles. The acrid smell of a burning castle, the cries of families torn apart, the clash of metal in mortal combat. These aren't mere backdrops for heroic dramas. This is reality, driven not by a code of honor, but by cold, calculated, legalized cruelty. This is important because romanticizing the past, particularly its most brutal aspects, prevents us from understanding how power truly works, how easily violence is justified, and how thin the line is between law and savagery. This understanding makes us more insightful about modern conflicts, about how those in power can shape the rules in their favor. Recall that first image. You're a merchant, your caravan stopped, and armed guards with crude sneers demand triple payment. Back then, it seemed like arbitrary extortion. Now you understand. It wasn't arbitrary rule, but merely a small part of a vast system where violence was legalized, where law was a tool for the powerful, and protection simply meant choosing who to pay tribute to. The cold steel at your throat was no accident. It was a symbol of an era where survival wasn't determined by nobility, but by understanding who had the right to violence and who would exercise that right. Medieval warfare and chivalry weren't about glory and nobility, but about logistics, endurance, and systematic terror, where law was a weapon, not a shield.